Hi there, AP Euro students, and welcome to the second part of today's lecture of 7.5, Mass Politics. Today we're going to be looking at France and its politics between 1870 and 1914. So France's loss, devastating and surprising loss in the Franco-Prussian War, had led to a very divided nation. Of course, their loss in the Franco-Prussian War had led to the capture of Napoleon III, and as a result, a collapse of the Second French Empire, all of which was very humiliating. As the empire collapsed, there was a lot of question over what government France should pursue following the Franco-Prussian War. Should they be a monarchy or should they be a republic? There was a lot of support for a republic, returning to a French republic, especially among socialists and Marxists and other radicals. But there was also a lot of support for a monarchy, and the monarchists, the more conservative groups, tended to still dominate the National Assembly at this point. However, when France lost to Germany in the Franco-Prussian War, Bismarck, part of their peace treaty and part of their punishment was that Bismarck had actually required France to adopt universal male suffrage because he knew that using universal male suffrage would actually complicate the politics of France and make it more difficult for them to form a functional government, which would, of course, keep them weak and keep them away from Germany. So as France is recovering from this defeat and trying to establish a new government, the National Assembly, which was essentially the parliament of France, appointed Adolphe Thiers, an experienced and more moderate politician, to be the interim executive for France, essentially function as a president. However, this demonstrated the victory of a more conservative government. Granted, it wasn't a monarchy, but it was a National Assembly dominated by monarchists and more middle-class moderates. So in protest to this more conservative government, the Parisians elected their own city government called the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune was kind of harkened back to the days of the radical French Revolution in the late 18th century, when the city of Paris had a lot of influence directly on the revolutionary government. And so that idea was resurrected with the creation of this city government called the Paris Commune. This was actually formally proclaimed even before the peace treaty in the Franco-Prussian War was signed. If you remember, Paris had actually held out in the Franco-Prussian War and refused to surrender for several months after the rest of France had essentially been defeated. Anyway, the Paris Commune intended to administer Paris separately from the rest of France. They basically said they were going to become their own government and not follow the laws and the policies of the National Assembly. So many radicals and socialists participated in and supported the Paris Commune. And the Paris Commune refused to recognize that authority of the newly created National Assembly, like I mentioned. So this led to what was essentially a civil war in France. From March to May of 1871, the Paris Commune fought a bloody, violent struggle with the army of the National Assembly. Thousands of French people died in this civil war, and about 20,000 were subsequently executed after the conflict for their participation. So the Paris Commune was ultimately crushed by the new National Assembly. However, this led to long-term resentment from the working class against the middle class in France. So this actually accentuated a lot of the class differences and social tension in the French Republic. Adolphe Thiers' defeat of the Paris Commune and other firm measures implemented by his National Assembly, however, did allow France to begin a road to recovery. However, the Paris Commune became a legend across Europe. Marxists in many countries proclaimed that this was the first true proletarian government in Europe, and that it had been violently suppressed by the bourgeoisie. However, in reality, the Paris Commune was not exclusively middle class or Marxist. It had also been supported by many middle class Parisians. It had attempted to establish a radical proletarian-led government in France, but in reality, this led to a civil war in which Paris lost. And as much as you may be tempted to think of the National Assembly as the big bad guys, in reality, they had to take this action to keep France from breaking apart and preserving the Union, essentially. But the consequence, of course, is that it alienated Paris from the rest of the French provinces, just as we saw in 1848 and in other, dramatic moments in French history. So by 1875, the National Assembly had determined that France would once again become a republic. And so this begins the Third Republic of France. Just to give you some perspective, France is currently on its fifth republic. Now, this wasn't an easy resolution. The monarchists were, of course, adamant about returning to a monarchy, but there was a lot of argument over exactly who should be king. Should it be a Bourbon? Should it be from the Orleans family? Should it be a Bonaparte? As the monarchists quarreled among themselves, the Republicans gained strength, both the moderate and radical Republicans. The moderate Republicans benefited from Adolphe Thiers' destruction of the Paris Commune, which demonstrated to the fearful middle-class provincials, that's middle-class people living outside of Paris, that a republic could be moderate and socially conservative, that a republic was not necessarily radical. And so in 1875, the National Assembly created the structure for the Third Republic, which was largely dominated by the bourgeoisie. This government had a Chamber of Deputies that functioned as a parliament, and the representatives for the Chamber of Deputies were elected by universal male suffrage. There was also a Senate above that was chosen indirectly, and a president of France who was elected by the two legislative bodies. This Republican government stabilized France, but its effectiveness was limited ultimately by the lack of a strong executive and also the complicated multi-party system. The multi-party system led to coalition cabinets where many parties might come together to form a working majority, but these coalitions were fragile and frequently fell apart, leading to lots of instability in the government. However, this did prove to be the longest government in French history following the 1789 revolution. It lasted all the way until France was captured by the Germans in 1940. And after this point, France would never return to a monarchy. And while the Third Republic may seem like a momentary triumph for the more moderate middle-class bourgeoisie, it did implement some significant liberal reforms. First of all, trade unions were fully legalized. They had been suppressed by Napoleon III. And the most famous prime minister of this republic, a man named Jules Ferry, established secular education and reform. He expanded tax-supported public schools and implemented compulsory education, and also removed the Catholic Church from its role in traditional French education. Now, the greatest challenge to the Third French Republic was actually a scandal known as the Dreyfus Affair that occurred in 1894. The Dreyfus Affair demonstrated a lot of the conflict between the more traditional monarchists and conservatives in France and the Republicans. And the Republicans themselves had a rather fragile alliance between radicals and moderates and so on. So again, the Dreyfus Affair demonstrates the deep divisions that existed in France, the deep political divisions that existed in France in the late 19th century. This also was exacerbated by the role of the church. So the Catholic Church, as a traditional institution, was of course more supportive to the conservative groups, they were supportive of restoring a monarchy in France, especially as Republicans, especially under Jules Ferry, had become increasingly anti-clerical, removing the church from education in France. The Dreyfus Affair also demonstrated the growing anti-Semitism in European society and in the French government at the end of the 19th century. For example, many conservatives in France believed that the French Republic was only successful because it was backed by a conspiracy of the Jews. Anyway, let's get down to what actually happened in the Dreyfus Affair. First of all, the French military, falsely accused a Jewish captain in the French army, a man named Alfred Dreyfus, who you see on your right here, was spying for Germany and sharing military secrets with the Germans. And keep in mind that the Germans were the arch nemesis of France in this time. Because he was accused and charged with this really treasonous crime, he was sentenced to prison out in French Guiana, a French colony in the Caribbean. Now, many of the monarchists and the conservatives who had the support of the Catholic Church used this incident, this scandal, to discredit the Republicans. But at the same time, there were many doubts in France about the true guilt of Alfred Dreyfus. There was, in fact, a lot of suspicion that he had been framed, in fact. And by 1898, an army colonel named Georges Picquart, Picquart, Georges Picquart, who was the new head of French intelligence, was able to provide evidence that it was actually another officer, a Catholic aristocrat, who was clearly the traitor who had sold military secrets and spied for Germany. Now, the army, which was a stronghold of Catholics and aristocrats, refused a new trial for Dreyfus, despite this obvious new evidence. And their refusal to hold a new trial produced a wave of intense public outrage. This led to riots in France, people demonstrating in the streets and protesting. Everyone had an opinion about the Dreyfus Affair. In fact, Émile Zola, who you might remember as a realist author, wrote this famous front page expose in the newspaper. It's called J'accuse. You can see it over there on the right. That accused the army of deliberately denying due process to Dreyfus and suppressing or forging the evidence against him. Now, of course, the army did not appreciate this accusation, and they charged Émile Zola with libel. But ultimately, this situation was such a big scandal and so controversial that it produced public riots. It eroded public confidence in the Republic and other French institutions, and it deeply divided society. It does have a happy ending, however. Alfred Dreyfus was eventually pardoned of his crimes in 1899. He was able to come back to France, and he was fully exonerated in 1906. However, the drama of this event and the fact that this anti-Semitism was so prevalent in France, in Paris, the most industrialized, modern, and liberal country in the world, really concerned some of those Jewish leaders like Theodore Herzl. And so you might remember that this was one of the events that encouraged Theodore Herzl to create the European Zionist movement, as he believed that there would be no safe place for Jews in Europe after seeing the craziness of the Dreyfus Affair. Now, the Dreyfus Affair did lead to a change in the government. As moderate Republicans were voted out, they lost control, and radical Republicans gained a majority. So this led to more radicalism and anti-clericalism in the French Third Republic, as these more radical Republicans attempted to create a more democratic and secular state in France. And in wanting a more democratic society, the radicals challenged the army and the Catholic Church, and the army would be purged of all high-ranking officers who were anti-Republican. Many Catholic religious orders, some of whom had controlled French schools, were forced to leave France, and so France became much more secular. Church and state were officially separated in 1905, and the government seized control of a lot of church property and stopped paying clerical salaries. Now, this reaction seems maybe a bit extreme, but it did successfully end the political threat from conservatives and the more right-wing political groups, the monarchists, the church, more extreme nationalists and groups like that. So these changes did eliminate that conservative threat that came from the right to the Third Republic. But still, there were lingering problems in the Third Republic. By the turn of the century, France was lagging behind Britain, Germany, and the US in regards to industry. Also, little had been done to appease the discontent of the French working classes and their abysmal working conditions. As a result, worker strikes were frequent, and this led to brutal government repression, which honestly further alienated much of the working classes. And finally, France continued to hate and resent Germany and long for revenge for their loss in the Franco-Prussian War. So there was a lot of hatred towards Germany and fear of Germany. And that new rivalry was one of the most tense relationships in all of European politics in this period. So we'll pause there for part 2 as we wrap up France in the late 19th and early 20th century. So just to recap, France has become a republic, but it had a lot of political divisions between the conservatives, the moderates, the radicals. This is what led to the creation and the defeat of the Paris Commune. This also was exacerbated by the scandal known as the Dreyfus Affair. The reaction from the Dreyfus Affair was that France became more radical and anti-clerical, which successfully crushed any real threat from conservatism in France. But overall, France continued to be fairly unstable with these deep political and social divides, especially as we head into World War I. Stay tuned for the next part of the lecture, which will focus on Great Britain.